English translation, Willem, Mondria, Switzerland. Victors and Losers by Billy Edward Albert Meier.
Very many human beings want to see themselves as victors always at the cost of others, which is why they are wild about arrogantly assessing others and finding and seeing errors by them which they themselves also have, but are too cowardly to admit to these themselves. However, with this, that they see the errors only by the fellow human beings and maliciously talk about and assess them, they erroneously believe that they could show how great they are and put themselves in a better light. But how they thereby deceive themselves and cut off their noses to spite their faces is something that they, in their foolishness, are not capable of comprehending. Now, fact is that many human beings want to make themselves great and raise themselves up through the debasement of another human being in order to appear more than they really are. A wanting to be better as well as an errorlessness are demonstrated by accusing others of errors, although the accusers themselves have, as a rule, enough skeletons in the cupboard and would be better sweeping away their dirt from in front of their own doors. Fundamentally, the accusation of an error for the pure debasement of the fellow human being is a lousy and nasty method in order to be acknowledged by others who fall for these machinations. And unfortunately, it is actually so that nasty and lousy human beings of this kind believe themselves to be great, strong, and successful if they can accuse others of errors and can stamp them into the ground. In their abnormality, they can only prove themselves by insulting, harming, lovelessly treating, and debasing others. A human being, however, who is really good, peaceful, and free in himself or herself, harmonious and equalized, doesn't have to confirm that himself or herself through unfine and dignityless words and deeds, or have this confirmed through the fellow human beings. A true human being doesn't have to put his or her humaneness, honor, deference, and dignity in the limelight at the cost of others. If a human being is, in abnormality, dependent upon inflicting defeats and debasements on other human beings in order to prove himself or herself and to be seen as a winner, then he or she can never be a true and real victor. The truth is namely that such a human being is an absolute zero and is dependent on those whom he or she stamps into the ground and sees as losers. If, for such apparent winners and victors, there were no fellow human beings whom they could erroneously consider as losers, then they also could not believe themselves to be victors. To be a victor over a loser is nothing more than an irrational delusion that forms itself in sick brains, because a true victor possesses the greatness not to require a loser for his or her victory. Thus, a real victor is a human being who does not need any other human being as a loser in order to emerge as a victor. A real victor needs only himself or herself, his or her own power and energy, his or her intelligence, his or her thoughts and feelings, his or her true love, the inner freedom and harmony, as well as his or her equalizedness and his or her real peace in himself or herself, as well as in relation to his or her entire environment. A human being who through all the good values achieves a victory against and over himself or herself never has the need to attack fellow human beings, to fight against them, to discriminate against them, to insult them, and to debase them. And for a human being who is a true victor in this sense, there never is a necessity to have to defend himself or herself against verbal, slanderous, and lying attacks of aggressive fellow human beings. This is not a helplessness, but rather the way of the pure rationality and love, because a desire of the revenge and retribution shall never arise, because these unvalues create again evil, revenge, and retribution. Thus also anxiety, anger, and rage as well as self-pity shall be avoided, because these do not lead to the victory but to the losing. A victory can be won without a fight, so there is also no loser. An attacker can never be a victor, because through his or her attack, he or she harms himself or herself in such a wise that he or she remains in every case always a loser, because he or she is conquered by his or her own aggression, wherethrough a gaining of a victory becomes impossible. A true victor conquers his or her anxiety, his or her anger, his or her rage, his or her evil thoughts and feelings, as well as his or her emotions and all desires for revenge or retribution. Out of this arises neither guilt nor atonement, because if no resistance is given, no attack can occur. This is the form of a victory being achieved without there being any fighting connected with it. And this form of the being victorious without losers is applicable in every respect of the daily life. If the things do not get badly out of the control of the good human nature and develop into the exchanging of blows, which must possibly be countered with a defense that also includes such, in which case there are then truthfully only losers and no true victors, as there is bodily harm on both sides. The talk shall not be of that, but rather of the winning and losing in the general relations of the human beings with each other, although unfortunately fights are carried out which result in no victors, but rather only losers. Be this in the family between man and woman, between the parents and children, between the brothers and sisters and the relatives or at the workplace, in the firm between superiors and subordinates, in the school between the students and the teachers, in the military between the officers and the soldiers, etc., or be it in the advertising for all kinds of products. But that is not all, as ongoing fights also take place between the governments, authorities, and the citizens, between the moralists, religionists, sectists, and the believers, as well as between the doctors and the patients, the bosses and the employees, etc. These fights take place day in, day out, and they are attacks that impinge upon the human being hour after hour and have an effect like a violently pelting storm with lightning and thunder. Human beings actually fight daily like the lunatics in order to defend themselves, in order to claim their right to be treated, and to be able to live in a wise that more or less conforms with the dignity of a human being. The fighting occurs for the money, for the honor and dignity, and the fighting occurs for the possessions, for the love, for the injured pride, for the reputation, and for very many other things. Human beings fight like this day in, day out, for whatever it may be. They fight and fight, toil away and overexert themselves with their powers, energies, abilities, and possibilities, but without them having the slightest chance of being able to achieve a real victory. They fight for things to which they give great importance and of which they believe that without them they would not be able to live. That, however, makes them open to attacks, because there always is and will be someone who is of a different view and who becomes aggressive to make those attacked compliant in order to be able to misuse them for their own purposes, be it through work-based financial or sexual exploitation, through violation, for perjury, or for any other kind of exploitation. And the sad thing about this is that the human being must face these constant fights, whether he or she wants to or not. The constant fighting of the human being in the above-mentioned sense brings him or her in the course of his or her life no valueful change, out of which love, inner peace and inner freedom, harmony and equalizedness could arise. And also since time immemorial, these fights have brought the human being no true and valueful progress. The human beings have not become happy due to these fights, and have also not created any true progress through them, let alone that a valueful evolution would have proceeded out of them. Through these fights there have, since human memory, always clashed only opponent and opponent, human beings, who met each other aggressively in any kind and wise, and who became losers on both sides. If a call is made for donations for the victims of the arbitrariness of despots, against the hunger of those suffering hardship, or for the victims of earthquakes and floods, etc., then a battle for pity is started immediately, and millions are donated. Donations are, However, as a rule, only made so that the well-off and rich can, on the one hand, show publicly their duty to the fellow human beings and fulfill it in a seeming form, and on the other hand, in order to free themselves from their guilty feelings towards those who are poorer and those who have nothing. Truthfully seen, thus only a sanctimoniousness in order to see oneself as benefactor and victor over those who, as one suffering hardship, are losers of the society and of the humankind. This is a form of a world conflagration which effectively knows only losers, because every penny that is donated out of false pity and out of guilty feelings is a penny to the loss of one's own dignity and honor, through which donors make themselves to losers in relation to the losers, and also confirm this through their donation. That is entirely contrary to true human beings, for whom the readiness to help those fellow human beings suffering hardship is a daily and natural duty, which they, out of love and true humaneness, fulfill out of their own initiative and out of their own assessment without being called upon and requested to do so. Contrarily, if the battle of pity is over for those donors who are, through pleading, called upon and asked to give, and it has faded away in the memory of the human beings, then no more thoughts are wasted on the ones suffering hardship, whatever for, since the needy and those suffering hardship are only losers, in comparison to whom the noble donors see themselves as glorious victors. But what a doubtful victory this is! In reality, the ones suffering hardship continue to suffer. Nevertheless, they are intentionally forgotten, because with the donating of the pity pennies, sufficiency was given to the obligation. The recipients of the donations shall after all cope with their wrong hopes themselves. And how is it after all? There are large sums collected for the ones suffering hardship, which are then for the most part pocketed by the aid organizations themselves as operational costs. Time and time again it is pretended to fight for the peace in the world, to create love and harmony in the family and amongst the human beings, and to be concerned about the real freedom of the humankind. Appeals are made, therefore, which cost millions, and human beings in masses and in kilometer-long lines demonstrate for this, holding burning candles in their hands in order to form chains of lights which are supposed to embody love, harmony, peace, and freedom. The clothes and faces of the human beings are painted, with the death rune and the symbol of the death instead of with the true symbol of the peace. The human beings are misled concerning this, because some crazy lunatics want to have the death rune changed into a peace symbol, but in doing so they suggestively and forcefully bring about death, ruin, and destruction. And what comes out of all this? Nothing good, since very often the fighters for love, peace, freedom, and harmony get in each other's hair and bash each other's skull in, come into conflict with the authorities and security forces, and again the spilling of blood is in full swing. Where are the victors here? There is in fact also here only losers on both sides, those that are wounded, hit, spat upon, maltreated, insulted, beaten, humiliated, and even dead. And naturally everyone screams for revenge and retribution. If the religions and sects are looked at and considered, then the frightening truth shows that more human beings were tortured, massacred, and murdered in the name of God, and in the name of the love, wisdom, and the love for the next human being than what happened under Genghis Khan, Attila, or any other war criminal. Also creatures like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Radovan Karadzic, George Walker Bush, Ariel Sharon, Yasser Arafat, Slobodan Milosevic, Nicolae Ceausescu, and other genocidal consorts are and were true harmless ones in comparison. Also they were and are in truth not victors, but rather only poor and furthermore depraved, dignityless and honorless losers, who were and are without any humaneness. Wherever the earth human looks, he or she finds nothing or only very rarely something that corresponds to a true victory. With sects and religions, with war, death penalty, hatred, revenge and retribution, as well as with constant fights for might, goods and chattels, for riches, profit, cheating, fame, image and possessions, etc., a better world and humankind has never been created, and that will also in future not be the case if the human being does not fundamentally change himself or herself to the better and positive. And if the human being does not follow the way of the better and positive, then he or she will never be a victor, but will always remain a loser who is ruled by hatred and inner restlessness, as well as by unfairness, suppression, exploitation, enslavement, and unhumaneness, as this has already been the case since time immemorial. Since time immemorial, the earth human has shouted for love, peace, harmony, fairness, right, and freedom. And for this he or she has shed blood, sown hate, murdered, and destroyed, but has never become the victor in these things, rather always only the loser. Instead of creating the high values of the love, harmony, freedom, and peace he or she has in the course of the time, in his or her fight delusion, in his or her hatred, his or her pathological craving for revenge, and in his or her compulsion for retribution and conquest, as well as in his or her imperiousness and pathological craving for recognition, invented and created only things which served and continue to serve the bloody fight. Consequently, the earth human has invented and amassed terrible deadly weapons, weapons of mass destruction, which, in their effect, exceed all that which the nature is capable of bringing forth in terms of catastrophes. With all the many different kinds and uncountable weapons and weapon systems, it has become possible for the earth humans to destroy themselves as a humankind 1,000 times, and to completely destroy the homeworld earth. As a result, the human being has once again not made himself or herself to the victor, but rather to the loser. Still, very many malicious and extremely negative things could be enumerated which do not make the earth human to the victor, but rather to the loser. But that would not lead him or her to changing himself or herself to the better. And it is actually so that each and every human being who openly announces these truths is outlawed, maltreated, sneeringly smiled at, threatened, struck, cursed as someone who wants to improve the world and possibly summoned to court, threatened with the death or even actually murdered in order to silence him or her. Consequently, many a broad-sighted human being loses the courage to shout out the truth openly, even though he or she sees and rightly assesses the entire misery. Nonetheless, the time is already long overdue to thoroughly call into question all the malicious and negative fighting of the terrestrial humankind, to shout the truth out openly and loudly into the world, that even the deaf can hear it. And never since time immemorial has everything been so urgent to shake the earthlings out of their lethargy, as this has become required and necessary in the present time. It is time that every single human being takes his or her life in his or her own hands in a truthfully and creational natural wise, in order to lead it valuably and to form the everyday life rightly, without malicious fights, which bring only harm, however no success, and do not make the human being to the true victor, but rather to the effective and bitter loser. To live without constant fighting has to be learnt, that cannot be denied, and with the right attitude and with the understanding of the life, it is also actually possible to get out of the way of any fight. Of course, to live in dignity, honor, and deference, in love, in inner peace and inner freedom, as well as in harmony and equalizedness, represents a great venture for the human being, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. If, however, the venture is taken on, then the entire life can change completely, at least for the individual, if not for entire families and groups, and indeed within a frame of the good, of the positive, and of the progress as well as of the evolution. Through this, the possibility then also arises that the human being finally becomes that which he or she truthfully is in his or her inner nature, which he or she, however, suppresses towards the outside and falsifies. And if this possibility is understood and taken cognizance of, then also the recognition grows that the existence up till now has only been spent in leading a senseless fight in order to be a completely other human being than what complies with the entirely own inner nature. If the human being really wants to be victorious and send the losing into oblivion, then he or she must develop an elitist consciousness attitude and show a behavior strategy which make him or her free of the nonsensical fighting, which only serves thereto. To want oneself to be great, to confiscate everything for oneself, to want to stand above the fellow human beings, to be able to exercise might over others, to be well off, rich, famous, or the boss, etc. The attitude and strategy as well as the insight must also be directed towards finally fighting only in a decent, honorful, and dignified wise for one's own progress and a volutive fight for the life. It must have an end to senselessly fight out unfair fights for others, out of evil angst of taking over the responsibility oneself for the own life, all the own thoughts and feelings as well as for the own deeds. An end must also be therein that angst can further suppress the responsibility for an own and real victory in order to get out of the treadmill of the constant losing. Everything sounds indeed easy and obvious, but it truthfully is not, because a corresponding motivation and strategy must first be created, and required first and foremost is the understanding what the whole is all about. And only when these values are created and are clear can a readiness arise to occupy oneself with them henceforth in the life, to work towards constant victories, and to send the losing into the past and oblivion. If the human being wants to swim on top in the life and change everything to the better, then he or she must become conscious that he or she has, through his or her nonsensical fighting for things of a negative sense and wrong value during all times of his or her existence, earned himself or herself thousandfold debasements, disadvantages, vexation, strife, discord, hatred, revenge, and retribution. Thoughts as well as defeats and difficulties, instead of joy, love, advantages, peace, freedom, harmony, and equalizedness. If this cognition has ripened in him or her, then he or she no longer fights for things of a negative sense and wrong value, because he or she has already conquered these through his or her cognition. Guilt feelings also fall away with this, because if nothing more is done that is wrong, then the human being also no longer feels guilty. A human being, however, who is free of guilt feelings can also never be blackmailed. This is the way of the human being in order to be a victor and not a loser.
July 13th, 2004, 10:41. AM Sim Yase Silver Star Center, Billy.